This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. We will also explore threats to meaningful engagement in sport and movement culture practices and ask questions about what we can learn about the human condition through our involvement in sport. The guests are leading scholars in human and social sciences of sport who share their explorations in a scholarly as well as a personal context. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. I am delighted to introduce today's episode, which focuses on understanding how gender informs meaning in sport. I feel that this is such an important topic that it should have featured in this podcast already a long time ago. Indeed, sport is a very gendered institution, and although there has been a lot of effort to tackle gender-based inequalities in the past few decades, a lot of work certainly remains to be done. In today's episode, we explore how gender identity intersects with athletic identity, with the focus on women's martial arts. We discuss what discourses are dominant in the sporting spaces and how these impact those who are unable or unwilling to accept and live according to these discourses. We then move on to exploring the possibilities of alternative meanings, discourses, and practices of sport, and finally discuss whether and how sporting spaces that are not based on a binary understanding of gender can be organized, as well as the ethical imperative to organize sporting spaces that are inclusive and safe for all. Our guest has completed several interesting research projects on gender in sport. She completed her PhD in sports sciences at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland, which focused on understanding women's identity negotiations in competitive judo cultures. After defending her PhD, she continued working as a postdoc researcher at the University of Jyväskylä in a project that focused on tackling discrimination against gender and sexual minorities in sport and physical education contexts. She then moved on to the School of Sport and Service Management at the University of Brighton and currently works as a postdoc researcher in a project titled Transforming Gender Boundaries in Sport, which is funded by the Finnish Cultural Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Anna Kavoura, and thank you so much for joining me for today's interesting and very important discussions.
Hi, Noora. Thank you for having me.
I'm delighted that we are now here discussing this, and we have talked about this already a long time ago, and so now we finally get going, and I cannot emphasize enough how much I feel that this is a very important topic to address, and for us to understand meaning in sport, we always have to be thinking about this gendered element of meaning and how our cultural practices also shape those meanings. So I'd be very delighted to hear a little bit about how you have become a gender scholar and, a sports scholar, of course, as well. But your research in the past 10 years already has always been addressing these gender issues. So perhaps a little bit about the background story of how you became a gender researcher.
Yeah, sure. So, yes, I am always a little bit hesitant to call myself a gender scholar because, as you said, my background is in sports science and majoring in sports psychology. And I think it was sometime towards the end of my master's studies when I started realizing that this focus on performance alone, that sometimes like mainstream sports psychological theories are all about, especially when it is done in a way that neglects the context and the situational characteristics of the individual, such as gender, race, class, religion, and so on. Like this way of work does not interest me that much. And I became especially interested in gender. I think my interest also comes from my personal experiences. My experiences, for example, of being a female athlete in the male domain of martial arts, but also experiences that go way back before that, experiences of a girl growing up in the patriarchal culture of Greece, for example.
Yeah, and so you already mentioned that you're a martial artist and a high-level martial artist, I have to add there. And in your PhD research, you took advantage of being an insider in the martial arts culture and then being able to do this research as from the insider perspective a little bit as well. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about that work that you started doing in your PhD and the research and the findings as well.
Yeah, so basically it started as an exploration of my own, personal questions, let's say. For example, I was wondering how come in most places that I have trained, there are only very few women. Sometimes I am the only one. Why women often drop out from martial arts or don't even come to try it and so on. So I was in the beginning interested in these questions when I started my PhD. Yeah, at that time there weren't that many studies available on at least psychological studies on gender in martial arts. There were some sociological investigations that were discussing the constraints for women in this kind of hierarchical system of gender in sport. How, for example, gender stereotypes are saving the experiences of women and the strategies that they have to employ in order to kind of adapt and succeed in this male domain. So I based my study on interview data mostly, and ethnographic data, but mostly interviews from Finland and from Greece. And interviews with female judo athletes. And while I started looking at I was interested in the beginning at the strategies that successful, let's say, female athletes have used to adapt in this male domain and to succeed in their careers. That was my initial idea when I started, but it ended up being more complex than that. I mapped out a complex system of discourses that athletes draw upon when they make sense of their experiences. So at the end, I wrote about that. I ended up writing about the cultural discourses and how these shape the experiences of women in martial arts, and how they shape the ways that we kind of perform and negotiate our identities in sport.
Yeah, and you already mentioned the word discourses and cultural discourses, and I'm sure that for some listeners this is very familiar, but perhaps not so much for others. So if we talk a little bit about discursive approaches, so how does that inform how we think about identity is what you looked at, and also how we think about meaning in sport, which would be the topic of our podcast.
Yeah, so when I say cultural discourses, I am drawing from a Foucauldian understanding of discourse. So I mean sets of knowledge and practices that shape our ways of thinking. For example, like discourses about motherhood, shape our understanding of like who or what is a mother, who is a good mother, and so on. Like discourses, sport and athletic performance discourses shape our understanding of who counts as an athlete, who is a good athlete, who is a successful and elite athlete, and so on. Discourses about femininity, who counts as a feminine woman, and so on. Yeah. So all these discourses shape our ways of thinking and feeling about the world and about ourselves and about others. And these discourses, of course, they are cultural in the sense that they might be different discourses in different times and places. For example, different discourses in the East and the West, in different countries or in different historical periods. And these discourses are also like multiple in the sense that we can come across like several and sometimes competing discourses. But some of them will always be more accessible or more privileged, more valued than others.
Yeah.
And so also the way that we like that we construct and negotiate our identities, like in this framework, identity is something fluid. So something that we take up pieces from these discourses and we construct our identity, and it is always like a subject of negotiation because the discourses around us are also like shifting. So it's not, it kind of, this view rejects the essentialist view of identity as something like fixed and rigid that resides within the individual.
Yeah. So we are always negotiating and trying to figure out how we position ourselves when we have these conflicting discourses. And you already mentioned possibly conflicting discourses that surround what it means to be an athlete or a good athlete, and what it means to be a woman or a feminine woman. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about these conflicts or these negotiations that you were looking into in your research.
Yeah, so I can maybe like try to summarize the results, like the main findings of my PhD in a very simplified way. When I tried to map the discourses that female judo athletes draw upon in Finland and in Greece to kind of make sense of themselves and their experiences, I found certain cultural differences, let's say, but also some similarities. And if we start from the differences, for example, it was very different the way that athletes in the two countries related or positioned themselves in this femininity discourses. So, for example, the kind of understandings of like who counts as a feminine woman was these understandings were very rigid in Greece. And so especially the younger athletes, they were very worried about, are they still feminine if they are doing this kind of often labeled as masculine sport of judo, and is like lifting weights, for example, that, like elite athletes do, is it somehow going to make them less feminine? And as you can imagine, this also constrained their performances, I think, because if they are like worried of like lifting weights or like doing a proper training because of, like being afraid of having extra muscle, because this might be considered in the culture as not feminine. So there were these kind of worries in the talks of like the Greek, especially the young Greek, like female judo athletes. While this was not at all, like almost at all in the worries of Finnish female athletes, because I think the cultural discourses of femininity in Finland are more flexible and fluid. Yeah, feminine woman can mean many things, things, and they couldn't imagine how this could contradict with their, like with them doing judo.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the Finnish context was maybe like a little bit healthier, let's say, for young female athletes, but allowed for example, for multiple expressions of femininity, and combining those with being an athlete. But I also found in my study certain similarities in the two countries. For example, almost all the athletes that participated in my study, in a way or another, they drew on a discourse that I called in my dissertation like the female biological inferiority discourse. So especially when they wanted to explain why there aren't that many women doing judo, they draw on explanations, these kind of dominant explanations of women by nature are not, good enough for judo.
That men are stronger by nature and women are weaker
exactly.
by nature.
So women are feeling pain easier and get hurt easier, and these kind of explanations. And then when I was asking about themselves, so how have you managed all these years and you have overcome the injuries and you train hard and so on? And they were saying, but I was born differently. I was always a tomboy, and so on.
Yeah.
So this kind of explanations, and of course, this is not to blame women, but we are brought up in this discourse that women are by nature more fragile, and men are by nature stronger, more aggressive, more competitive, are more natural fighters.
Yeah, we discussed that, I guess, a few times over the years, and I find it quite interesting that when I was doing this research with recreational runners in China who were, for example, training to run a marathon or a half marathon, also they would draw, even if we are not talking about elite sport, we are talking about recreational running, that often it comes up that they are somehow exceptional, that the typical woman doesn't have that in her, that they would get up in the morning and go running for 10 kilometers and then go to work. So that they are somehow in opposition or very different from the so-called average woman or normal woman. So this kind of separating yourself from women in general was also quite prevalent in these recreational and non-elite runners.
Yeah, exactly. So we see how strong, how dominant this discourse is, and it's maybe we can also say that it is I don't want to use the word global, but we meet this discourse in many cultural contexts.
Yeah.
It seems it just shows how powerful it is.
Yeah. Go on with your findings. I interrupted you a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that this was the main findings, and then I ended up writing about how we female athletes, with the ways that we perform our identities, because when these discourses are available to us, we also perform our identities in a certain way in order to become accepted and succeed in this cultural context. And we often end up reproducing the same discourses, the same gender stereotypes that are there to oppress us. So I ended up writing about this, about how female elite athletes often end up with the way we talk, the practices we draw upon, the ways we perform our identity, how we end up like reproducing these gender stereotypes, which might be a good strategy for, like becoming accepted in a male domain, but it doesn't help it towards like gender equality.
Would you see some kind of resistant discourses or alternative understandings that the female athletes would draw on to make sense of their experience, or would you say that the stories that you heard in your research were very much shaped by the dominant ideologies or the dominant discourses of high-level sport?
Well, of course, there are always like alternative discourses and discourses of resistance, but I found those discourses in a more like, now I'm not talking only about my PhD, but like I'm talking about, like the different projects that I have worked like within the past 10 years. But I found these alternative discourses mostly in, let's say, non-elite spaces.
Yeah.
Like somehow in elite sport, these dominant, these essentialist understandings of gender are more powerful. And then there are spaces of resistance, but somehow these exist outside of the elite sport system.
So maybe we can talk about those alternative discourses and different ways that gender might be then constructed in these non-elite contexts, if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, for example, like there are contexts that exist outside of the elite system. Like I am talking about community organized sports spaces, queer sports spaces, like leftist sports spaces, and so on. And in these sports spaces that exist outside of the elite sports system, there can be let's say an exploration of non-binary ways of organizing sport, for example, one thing, and also like exploring different let's say meanings for sport in general. Like I mean, you have written a lot about that in your work, about how like this elite sport or sport for health is not that maybe that viable anymore, or it doesn't make sense for all people. And I totally agree with that. And then these spaces allow for exploration of other meanings, I think. So, for example, doing sport for solidarity, or, exploring other performances of gender through sport.
Yeah, I think that would be what you said about doing sport for solidarity, and when you include politics and this challenge to the gender binary, those would be some of those spaces where this logic of sport is very much challenged. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about those spaces and the work that you are doing around those things at the moment.
Well, I don't know if I have like that much to say right now, because I am just starting an ethnographic exploration of like such spaces, particularly of transinclusive sport spaces right now. So I am in the first months of my this new project, and I just started the data collection. I don't have any findings to share. But let's say from my experiences so far of visiting such spaces, and from the first data that I have, I can say that like there are really interesting, nice like stuff going on there, that maybe strategies that we could explore if we can take, like, because right now we all come to understand that, for example, these like gender categories in sport are not working that well anymore. We come to understand that with these rigid categories, we exclude like many people, more people than we thought like some years ago. So they even kind of overlap with human rights at some point. So in these spaces, so we come to realize that, but we are having trouble on thinking alternatives. We have, it is hard for all of us to imagine sport organized differently in a non-gendered way or in a non-performance orientated way. Or it is hard for us to imagine how it could be done differently. And these spaces, I think, they allow a window into that, because there are, interesting alternative stuff that have been going on there for years that have not been very visible, because they exist outside of the dominant sport culture, but they have been going on for years, and they can allow, they haven't been researched much so far, but now they can allow a window towards these alternative practices.
Yeah, just like you said, it's quite difficult for us to imagine what sport could be if it's not constructed within this gender binary and this performance oriented culture as well. Can you think of examples of some of these practices or the ways that sport is organized in these spaces to maybe help us imagine how things could be different?
Yeah, well, I really liked, I can say about, a few months ago, I was at an anti-fascist martial arts tournament in the UK. Mm-hmm. And I really like the way that it was organized in of course they had also visible feminist and transinclusive politics. So it was it was already in the announcement of the event that these are the values and principles that this event is organized based on inclusion and feminist politics and so on. But in actual practice of how the competition was organized, so the sport participants, when they were filling the registration form, they could, of course, they were writing because they were several martial arts disciplines for which you could participate. So you would, state your martial art discipline, your age, your weight category, how many years of experience you have. And then you would choose your preference in terms of gender, or against which gender, let's say, you would like to compete against. And there were people that they were writing, I want to compete against men or against women, or I don't mind at all. Both, right. I don't mind. And then they were trying to create a nice match for everybody. So I think that went really well. There were many, mixed gender fights that happened, and it went really well. And there were many non-binary people participating in the event. So I think that was a nice example.
Did you compete yourself, or you were there
No, I was I refereed a bit. I refereed a bit. I coached a bit. This was also funny. This was funny because I was it is funny how I realized how this, competing discourses are also shaping my my coaching. I don't know, it was sometimes I was, of course, shouting for the person that I was cornering to I wanted him to win, so I was shouting, do this and do that, and I was maybe shouting, wanting him to win and kind of giving performance orientated instructions and so on. And then I was realizing the context, and that we are, the aim of this event is also, to get the experience, to have fun. It is, a solidarity orientated event and so on. And then I was adding, good work, both of you, good work. So it was like funny to see how these discourses are like competing also in me. Yeah, because of course we are all like, if you have been doing sport and if you have been like participating in competition, like we are brought up in this culture of, like the performance is all that matters. So it is like hard to I don't know, to escape from this way of thinking. Like,
yeah, I guess then we come to these questions about what is sport and what is exercise. Like, of course, we have these cultures of exercise or movement culture where there is no competition, but like in sport cultures, that aspect of competition is something that makes it sport and not exercise. But then how we think about competition, so what you mentioned about, is competition everything that matters, or how important is winning? You can still compete, but you don't have to be thinking that winning is the only thing that matters. That's what you are telling me about this different way of organizing the competition, and you are saying that there are other values that are probably more important in that cultural context than winning, and whether somebody won or somebody lost their fight is probably not the key thing at the end of the day of this kind of event.
Exactly, yes. And there are many scholars that are, like writing that, we should maybe ditch the elite sports system altogether. I mean, if we are hoping for equality, for gender equality in particular, because like there is no way we can achieve that in this kind of like competitive elite sports system. And I'm not sure, I definitely see the point, and I now come to also start valuing more the non-elite, non-performance, non-competition orientated sport cultures and events. But I think there are also meaningful experiences that one can take, and important life experiences and lessons to learn within the elite sport system. And for me, it is not just that some people do not have access to this. Like, for example, non-cisgender people are denied access, are sometimes denied access to this elite sport system because of the rigid binary gender categories.
Yeah.
So we can ditch it altogether, but then, I don't know. I think it's something like, I sometimes compare it with the institution of marriage. Okay. Mm-hmm. So there are, some people believe that this is also an institution that we could ditch. It has a history, let's say, of controlling women's sexuality, or I don't know, a history of the state controlling, people's lives and so on and so forth. So why would you even want to be part of this, system? If you want to be, with someone, you can just live together and that's all. So, but in the same time, so why, for example, LGBT people would even be interested in such a system? But in the same time, if this system exists, it cannot be that some people do not have access to this. It is just not just, since we have this system, everybody should have access to that.
And that would then also mean to work to create these competitive or more elite sport cultures in the way that people of all genders have the possibility to take part.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that, exactly.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in this show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.